Hey, I'm Anthony Gonzalez, and this is Miami Shine Podcast. So much has changed so fast in the midst of the coronavirus COVID 19. For this episode, I'm focusing on how the coronavirus is impacting our churches. Churches have a long held custom of gathering in large crowds, shaking hands, hugging, taking communion, passing the donations plate, and so much more. How does your church continue to function through this pandemic? For this conversation, I've invited my friend Jeff Reed, who's in the front lines of helping churches do church online. Check this out. Hey, Jeff, thanks for being on the podcast. We were originally set to meet in the studio, but I was recently informed of certain complications as a result of the COVID-19 virus, more commonly referred to as the coronavirus. So here we are. Thanks for being on the podcast. Jeff, I had the pleasure of meeting you several months ago, and we spoke, and you told me about what you do and how you work with churches to help them do church online. And I remember thinking at the time that this is relevant, that it has value, and that it would eventually be the next frontier for churches. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say that because you've been ahead of the curve with this, some churches at the time embraced your message, and others perhaps expressed some hesitation to this new way of doing church. However, everything seems different now, and your services, knowledge, and your skills now are on high demand as churches across the nation scramble to adjust and adapt to these new conditions. At this time, the latest recommendation by the federal government is to reduce public gatherings to 10 people or less in order to promote social distancing and to limit the spread of the coronavirus. So tell us, how have things changed for you since the outbreak of the coronavirus?
Wow, that's like a loaded question, man. Way to like kick it off with a strong one. Here, yeah. So coronavirus has turned me from the geeky guy that runs the AV club that's stuck in the closet, to everybody's best friend. Everybody wants to hang out with. Everybody wants a piece of. It's been incredible. Like I can tell you, there's stories of pastors that I've had the opportunity to meet with, as recently as probably 5 or 6 months ago. This one situation with a pastor who said, Jeff, back in probably November, Jeff, yeah, I don't believe in church online. I think it's a sin. I think you're actually taking people away from the body of Christ, and there is no way that I will ever broadcast a service online. That pastor called me probably less than a week ago on a Saturday in a panic, trying to figure out how to get his church to continue to run utilizing church online. So it's amazing where some pastors who may have had theological concerns, are now kind of embraced with this idea of, okay, we gotta do something, or else our churches are shutting down. It's funny. It's the old Mike Tyson quote. Everybody's got a plan till they get punched in the face. A lot of churches unfortunately got punched in the face as a result of coronavirus. Forgive the analogy, but they got punched in the face. And now it's like, how do we adjust from this? How do we embrace this? And online is a huge option. I want to say online isn't the only option, but it is an option for churches, a popular option for churches to embrace and run with.
So
Traffic on my website has been up 1,000%. That's not an exaggeration. It's 1,000% week to week. Um, Demand for podcasts and webinars and blogs and content. And quickly, I just realized I'm a one man shop here, and I work for another company, Stadia Church Planting, as their director of digital planting, and like the demand for what I was doing quickly became bigger than just me. So we brought in some help, brought in some other writers. A lot more people are volunteering for the cause, because ultimately helping churches get online is hugely important in this role, in this world that we live in today.
And for our viewers, by the way, we're streaming from Miami, Florida. So Jeff Reed, who's with us this morning, is operating here out of Miami, Florida. Jeff, so you've been partnering with churches for some time, especially now more than ever, to do church online. And what I'm hoping to accomplish with this podcast today is to give out some important information for our churches, again, as they are trying to cope with these unprecedented and challenging times. So why don't we start from a basic point, which is what does church online mean? And again, that might be another loaded question, but
Sure.
uh, just in an overview sense, as we start to hear this term fly around a little bit more, what does it mean to do church online?
That's great. So the average church pre-coronavirus, when they would hear the phrase church online, they would think it would mean the broadcasting of their Sunday morning services in an online format, Facebook, somewhere on social media, YouTube, even to their own website. And so it's basically taking that 1 hour Sunday service that happens live within a physical environment and putting it live online with that. The reason, and honestly, even going back years, and I'm on record through blogs and podcasts on this, church is more than the 1 hour on Sunday. Like the entity of church, the functionality, the biblical function that God calls us to do is represented more than just the 1 hour service. And so the challenge of what I've been saying for a while is our church needs to represent more than just the service online. Like there's joining together in small groups, being part of biblical community. There's challenging people to be on mission, serving communities locally, and even being on mission globally. There's discipleship, and there's all sorts of other churchy words I could throw out, but there's more than what just happens in that 1 hour broadcast. And so I had built my platform, my company, around helping churches wrestle with this. And there are other guys that do this. It's not like I'm the only one. It's funny. There's like this brotherhood of the people who think this way around the country, and we hang out online and we talk about it and we share stories. But what happened with coronavirus is there's this now shift where the majority of churches, I mean, probably there's 350,000 evangelical churches in America today. Pre-coronavirus, I would say maybe 7,000 are broadcasting online, and that's actually probably a liberal guesstimate. And honestly, like the idea of even discipling someone online, the idea of doing these small groups, utilizing Zoom or things like that, discipleship happens in physical spaces pre-coronavirus. It does not happen online. It's not allowed to. So now that we don't have our buildings, we don't have our venues, our spaces, we cannot meet together. Churches are now are forced to this reconciliation place of realizing either we have to do discipleship online or we don't do discipleship for the foreseeable future, whatever that is. Now, if coronavirus is 2 weeks, 3 weeks, that's not, yeah, okay, maybe a small group can go a month without meeting. But worst case scenario, I don't know if that's worst case scenario. What if this does go 2 to 3 months? What if this does go extend beyond that? By the way, what's the psyche of a person after being locked up for 3 months after going through this scenario? Do you think they're going to openly welcome run back to a building? I think there's actually a mistrust, a distrust that's being built right now with buildings. We even saw that the weeks leading up to coronavirus, as we started to see more and more of this happen, over in Asia, more and more in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, where there was a distrust. Attendance was dropping at the church level. Why? Because I don't want to get sick. And I'll tell you, even just me as a personal level, if the CDC tells me, hey, it's completely safe to go back out into the world, I think I'm going to take like a week off and stay back and wait and see, because I don't know that I trust the CDC. Nothing against the CDC, but I don't want to be the guy to take that risk. There's something emotionally that's changing within people as a result of this. Coronavirus literally is changing culture almost to the hour, it feels like. With every CDC, when CDC made the announcement 6 days ago that they were going from 250 people to 50 people on a gathering, right there, that revolutionized things. The average church in America is 72 people right now estimates would say. 80% of churches are under 200 members actively involved. So small churches by far make up the landscape of who we are, right? So I'm just going to make a wild guesstimate. I don't have any scientific facts behind this. I believe 20% of churches shut their doors and will not reopen. The longer that um, the longer that coronavirus goes, the less those churches have funding to stay open. And things like salaries, things like rent, things like lease, all these things are in place. And I think coronavirus, worst case scenario, churches aren't going to survive this. The longer this goes, the harder it's going to be. Now, what's ironic is online is such a cheaper option to go through to do these things. Go ahead, Anthony.
Well, we know that the churches operate largely off of donations, right? And so you mentioned a moment ago that when we think of church online, we think about streaming our Sunday service. But you also touched on how church is more than just a Sunday service, right? We've got Bible studies. Some people call them small group gatherings. We also have different events that churches hold, and um, and we also have sacraments, right? The Lord's Supper, otherwise known as taking communion. We also have the collecting of the donations. How do churches manage that, right? If we take those elements and say, well, these are some of the components to doing church,
Mm-hmm.
and how I think we can wrap our head around streaming a service, but how do you perform the other functions of church in a time like this?
Yeah, that's great. The church is trying, and the church needs to keep its people. And we use the phrase in church leadership: the church needs to keep people on mission. The
Mm,
average church in America has some sort of a strategy. I've worked in churches that a very basic one was no, grow, serve. This is Austin Ridge Bible Church in Austin, Texas. They want people to know Jesus Christ. So there's an evangelism, a share piece, and that happens Sunday morning service. They want people to grow deeper in their faith, and that involves groups and biblical community, kind of gathering together in smaller, having two-way communications, and you can do things like this online through Zoom. And then there's the serve component where we want people on mission. We want people serving in their communities and doing different things. And really that's because the more that there's this recurring action, the more that we're engaging normally, the more that the more that people are staying connected with the church overall, the more normalcy they have in their lives, the more that they're grounded deeper in their faith. And so for a church, the goal would be to keep people on mission for that. Now like um, communion through a church online. I'll be honest, I've been doing communion for years, and I kind of joke about it. It's like bring your own grape juice. I've known people who have done communion online, and it's probably going to offend somebody. But if the only thing that they've got in their house to do online is Coke and a Snicker bar, that's cool. Grab the Coke, grab the Snicker bar, because it's not the physical, tangible things that you're doing. It's the moment of pausing and reflecting back. Man looks on the outward appearance. The Lord looks on the heart. And so sometimes you have to be creative with some of these things to create these physical, tangible, the communion things and the ordinances that we do as a church. I I know of a church, and this is I don't even know how they're handling this right now, but there is a church up in Seattle, Pacific Northwest. I had them on my podcast, this, but they would do communion. The way that they would do communion is that the church had to literally mail the communion elements to the parishioners. It was okay to do it online. It was okay to do it in homes. They would watch the service online. The priest would, do whatever he was going to do. But the only way that it was valid is if the church mailed it out.
mm,
And so, look, if that's what the church had to do, awesome, do that. You see, because at least then I give this church this one praise. They were at least creative in trying to figure out, what's really the problem? Where are we hung up on doing this online thing? specifically with communion. And for them, it was somebody needed to actually, like a priest needed to touch it.
Mm.
That's the hang up with doing communion online. The priest needs to touch the communion. I don't know where that's biblical. I'm not judging. But I am praising and applauding this because they found the solution. Okay, let the priest be the one who puts them in the that gets mailed out to the people. And so by doing that, they circumvented whatever their hang up was, and they were actually able to engage more online in a deeper way.
If we take it from a very basic perspective, what are some practical tips that you would give to a church? And in this time, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff, or give me your thoughts on it, but pre-coronavirus, maybe there was more consideration, or maybe there was more importance given to whether a church had a building, small building, big building. That seems to be largely irrelevant now, right? Small church, big church. Uh, Everybody's a small church now, right? And so, in a way, I think it kind of strips away some of these factors, maybe poses the fundamental question of what is church, right? I think we're forced to kind of go back to square one, scratch our heads a little bit, and say, okay, well, what does it mean to be a church when we're outside the building, when we're still staying on mission, as you said, Jeff, outside of the walls of the church? So now, as we scramble with these fundamental thoughts, how are some simple ways that any church can get started with church online?
Yeah, so the simplest way is figure out what the strategy of your church is and do it online. If your strategy is doing a church service, then did you break up? Or are we good? We good.
I
If
think we're
if the
good.
strategy is doing a church service, then do a church service. Figure out how to do it, and there's complicated ways, there's expensive ways, there's simple ways. It was funny, just last night, Outreach Magazine. I've got some friends over there. They messaged me that there's a new free tool that they just released. It's called freeonlinechurch.com, and it utilizes all free tools to help you stream a service online or to have a service available online on demand. And so for a church that's looking to do something in church online circles, like that's a simple way to do it. Tools like Zoom, to have that face-to-face communication for small groups, are very easy. Zoom is 40 minutes for free. There's other ones like talky.io. It's talky.io. Is similar to Zoom, but it's 100% free. Google Hangouts, Google Meet now, excuse me, is another one that's 100% free. Even some of these guys are lifting the lid in the short term to make it more available because there is such a need. So there's plenty of opportunity for tools out there. I can tell you through me at the Church Digital, we've got a kind of a startup page to help churches figure it out. It's thechurch.digital/start, START. There's no .com in that, by the way. It's thechurch.digital/start, and that's where you can find more resources on that. I'll tell you, for me, kind of to build off this, and let's do this real quick. Like, the interesting question, what you were alluding to, Anthony, is when all this is over, I think there's a different model of church where I don't think is actually built into and around a building. I think there's a model of church coming that's actually built and functions 100% in this digital venue, in this digital scope. And this is a lot of what we've been working on with Stadia Church Planning, is creating this model of a digital church. Like, I can tell you stories of a guy like DJ Soto, who's a church planner who planted a church in VR, virtual reality. He's on all VR, if you guys are on that platform or aware of it. But I'm talking like the full goggles, the avatars walking around, kind of thing, Ready Player One esque kind of, if you're familiar with that movie. So he had a couple hundred people online in his church, and the BBC, British Broadcasting Company, picked up the story and ran it that this guy was actually baptizing people in virtual reality. As a result of that, what happened was but what happened was other shows started picking up on it. Fox News, The Daily Show even ran a shtick on him on why he was baptizing people. What went from like 200 people became several thousand people, which became multiple virtual reality campuses across different continents. At this point, he's got three different uh, churches that are meeting here in America on those time zones, in Europe on those time zones, and he's even got one in like the Asian Pacific area. And so he's expanding and using virtual reality towards that. Other stories of a guy named Jade Earhart who uses video games as his platform, and is actually witnessing and evangelizing to people getting saved playing Destiny 2 on Xbox Live. There's another guy named oh man, I can never remember this guy's name when I need it. Daniel Herron. Daniel Herron was 11 years old and he was playing a video game called Roblox. I've never played Roblox. It's like Minecraft maybe a decade ago. At 11 years old, he built a church. His dad was a Presbyterian minister, and he built a church in Roblox, really similar to the Presbyterian church, actually. The kid's now 19. He's a college student. 8 years from when he built it, that church has impacted 26,000 people. And so there's this opportunity for us to do things in a digital environment, in a digital scope, that's not even like touching the physical space.
You mentioned a few resources a moment ago, which I'll include in the link below for our listeners, because I think that's going to be helpful. Now, in terms of equipment, so you mentioned some sites where people can go and enter a site and even for free without a charge, they can get their streaming going. Does a church need any specific equipment aside from, let's say, some video source, a computer, mics? I mean, if you're speaking to the church, to the person, Jeff, that says, I don't have the faintest idea on how to get running with church online, what equipment is needed?
Yeah. At the bare basics, your answer really comes down to quality. If you are a small church, you've got 30 people that are actively involved in your church, you can make it work with an iPhone. Just an iPhone to get that out there. What happens is that some churches, the larger they get, the more concerned they are with quality. And I will even say this, in this coronavirus season, I think that we people are far more forgiving about quality content issues than what we probably were pre-coronavirus. And so I'm more interested in churches creating a quantity of content as opposed to worrying about the quality of content. Some of the churches I'm working with are, let's do a daily sermon. Let's do a 4-minute, 5-minute sermonette each night. Let's do prayer meetings on a regular basis. I'm more interested in utilizing it often than saying, oh, we got to spend, $15,000 to build the perfect rig, blah, blah, blah. There may be a time for that later down the road, but I don't think that's where we are now. So things like an iPhone streaming to Facebook Live may be a great solution. Well, how does audio work in that type of model? How can we get the sound to sound perfect? Okay, figure out how to like have your pastor wear AirPods and he's preaching with that, and so the microphone is better on the AirPods than just on the phone. Well, how does music work? Because you got like the different elements and things like that. Music is just one way of worship. And in the physical church, it really defines worship. But if you actually look at the biblical standard of worship, music is one of just many. As a matter of fact, at some point it says that we are to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is our spiritual act of worship. And so I would look and challenge churches, and I have been, reimagine what worship is. I was talking with a pastor just recently, and he's got this big organ thing, and it's like the traditional church, and he's like, I don't know how to capture the audio of this, and I was like, what could you do differently in the season now that you couldn't before? And as I was helping him process through this, he came to this realization of, well, we could really have moments of prayer across our church where instead of worshiping by music, we're worshiping by praying together of an organized and structured prayer that is uniting us with God in a way that maybe worship in a building couldn't. And yet, community worship, gathering together, I don't want to downplay that. But I also think that this is an opportunity for us to do things differently, to re-engage with some of these other commands that the Bible calls us to do.
Jeff, as you're getting
Technical,
I'm sorry, go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, go
I was
ahead.
going to say technical. Just use what you got. If you need something to get on an encoder is really the hardest thing if you're not using an iPhone. Some of you guys may have a computer, or excuse me, a camera, a DSLR camera, a video camera, but you got to get the video from the camera to the internet. Once again, if you go to that thechurch.digital/start, there's several different options there, from a high-end professional down to a low-end free option through this free church online. So lots of different guidance there, and then there's ability to even get with me directly if you need some coaching or some help on that.
Excellent. So you mentioned simple tools or simple equipment such as the iPhone that someone might already have and a pair of iPods. That could be enough. And then getting onto a platform like one of the few that you've already mentioned, that could be enough to be up and running today as a church, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the overall charge would be, find ways on, do it. It's funny. I've had more calls about this one feature, and this is not something that I ever thought of. Like, this wasn't even on my radar. I've actually had half a dozen pastors reach out to me and ask about broadcasting audio only to like iPhone device, or what I knew about FM transmitters. Because what some churches are doing, and I've even seen some online, so it's there's a sub level of people that are doing this. Instead of broadcasting 100% online, they're literally doing like the old school drive-in movies. They're doing drive-in church, where they're setting up a stage in a parking lot, and they are having cars drive in. Everybody's staying in their car, but instead of like the audio boxes where they clip on the window where you can like hear the movie, they're using the iPhones tapped into the car stereos, or they're broadcasting on FM. And I'm looking at, honestly, and I'm like, that's ingenious. I never would have thought of that. That's not even in my scope. But I love that churches are being enterprising, trying to figure out, okay, my church, there's no way my people are going to get online. We are just not online people. But honestly, I don't want to die. Like, I need to engage with people. I need to keep them on mission. And there's no way that I can do this unless we physically meet together. So let's find a way to physically meet together. Now, as long as the police doesn't shut them down. I mean, they're all kind of like integrated within their car. It's an interesting take on that. So online is a very, I think it's a very easy way to do it. If online's not the way, churches, fight for whatever you got, man, to find that way to engage and do this.
And you mentioned that this last new clever idea of transmitting audio is something that you've gotten asked about a lot. Let me ask you this: what would you say is the most popular question that you've received since the outbreak of the coronavirus? I know that your phone is ringing off the hook, and I know that again, you're in high demand, and pastors and church leaders are eager to partner with you in this time to figure out how to continue to do church, how to stay on mission, how to remain relevant, how to stay alive in terms of continuing to operate, churches are in a very real sense facing and seriously having to consider whether they need to close their doors. So, what
Yeah.
would you say is if you can almost predict the next time that the phone rings and it's a new church, what would you say is one of the top questions that you're being asked in this time?
Yeah, the broadcasting of services. Here's I'll answer the question this way. I think the story is going to evolve. Right now, today, people are calling and they're asking about broadcasting services. Let's just I don't even want to speculate. Let's say this thing goes out 8 weeks. People right now are asking about broadcasting services. They're trying to figure out how to get their 1 hour on Sunday online, and so that's been the most popular one. Interestingly, I don't think that's the right answer. I don't think that's the right question. And I think in time, once we get to like week 3, week 4, and churches realize that just that 1 hour on Sunday isn't enough,
Mm.
and they're still having problems connecting because church is more than just that 1 hour on Sunday, I think that's when we start to shift. The question that I wish churches were asking today,
Mhm.
and some of them, the ones that were already broadcasting, are asking this question. The ones that aren't broadcasting are figuring out that mid step of broadcasting before they get to this one. The question that we need to be asking as a church is, how do we keep our people on mission? How do we keep people engaged to the mission? What is the thing that God needs them to do in this season? And it's not just watch a service broadcast. As a Christian, I believe this. I believe God's in control. It talks in Romans about how God, all leadership is instituted by God, which means whether or not you like Trump or hate Trump, God put Trump there. Some of you may hate God now as a result of that, but at the end of the day, it's the leadership that's instituted and is in place by God. And so if we roll that out, all of a sudden, hey, did coronavirus, was that orchestrated by God? And I don't mean to get like crazy here or to talk about this. God's in control of this situation, which means that if God's in control, things are working out the way that God wants it to. Now, people are dying. There's lots of sadness and things in the world. There's pain as a result of it. And I hate to say it, as Christians, we know that God's in control of this, which means if God's in control, there's something God wants me to do here. And not just me as Jeff as father, me as Jeff as friend, me as Jeff as neighbor. And I think the sooner that we can engage what God actually wants us to do, the closer we are to Him in this season. See, there's a purpose why coronavirus is here. We need, as a individual, as a Christian, we need to figure that out. Why does God have us here? What's our personal mission in this season? The church needs to start asking that question. How can we, the church, help our people find their personal mission in this season?
One of the things I was thinking about getting ready for this podcast with you is, obviously we are flooded with everything that is wrong right now. The media does a good job of emphasizing the catastrophe. And I think as a human race, as people, I think that we have this innate drive to search for silver linings, to search for some hope. Um, so I was thinking, and I was curious as to your thoughts on this. Uh, isn't there some truth, and tell me if you see it differently, but isn't there some truth that if coronavirus had to strike, uh, there are some advantages today in going through a pandemic, considering our technology, our digital platforms. If coronavirus struck 10, 20 years ago, sure, churches are struggling today, and many of them are having to close their doors or will be closing their doors. But how much more of an adverse impact would the church, in your opinion, would have suffered? Would it have even been able to brave such an outbreak 10, 20, 30 years ago? I mean, today we have different devices, we have certain technology in place, we have certain digital platforms, we have become familiar with Facebook Live and streaming to a certain degree, and not everybody's up to date, I guess we can say it that way, on these technologies, but they exist. So, isn't there a silver lining there that churches stand a chance if they go about this the right way? Whereas maybe some time ago, there wouldn't have been much of an option.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, Dark Ages, Black Plague. There have been lots of dark, even just the Bible improvement for us to survive. Um, the church, God's body, the bride of Christ, will survive this season. In some aspects, what it looks like, and once again, if God's in control, it's going to look like what God wants it to look like. Coming out of this, we've been able. I mean, I was even just reflecting. I did a talk for American Bible Society, and I actually come to like my experience being here in Miami with Hurricane Andrew, 1992, about just the upcoming tragedy and what it was like. But we didn't have after Andrew. I was out of my house for 18 months. I was living in hotels. I was living at my grandmother's house with like 12 other people. It was all over the place. There was no air. There was no food. There was no power. There was no Netflix. Dear God, there was no Disney Plus. I don't know how we survived those dark ages. And it's funny, like looking around, even where we are now. Yeah, we're locked in our house with these creatures. It's like there's worse places that we could be in history and in time.
Sure.
I do things. I do think that we will. Um, I think that we'll survive. I think culture will be have changed as a result of this, and that the world pre-coronavirus is going to look different than the world post-coronavirus. We need to be aware of that change is coming. Interestingly, for me, it was funny. I was talking with a couple of guys. Like I thrive on that. For me, it's like, wow, this is something new. This is a new opportunity. And for me, and I would suggest for the church that we need to look at this as an opportunity to grow on. The other thing that I know is this, and it was funny. There's a Fortune 500 CEO that I heard speak towards this. He's a Christian. It wasn't in Christian context when he said it, but he made this statement. He's like, post coronavirus, technology is going to grow faster, and that this is going to accelerate the rate of technology growth and development. We are already seeing it where companies are releasing platforms earlier than they wanted. They're developing software need pre-coronavirus to handle this situation to drive more people to online engagement. The technology push that we're seeing is being highlighted and celebrated in this season. People are going to be engaging more in the living rooms than in their houses, or than out in the public, obviously, because they're stuck in. The culture is shifting towards the living room, keeping people there, and there's also shifting towards accelerated growth in technology. Some of the things we were even planning to doing with digital church planning with Stadia, we were planning a 2-year process, and we're actually trying to even fast track because we're seeing that coming out of this, there's going to be more of a need to do things sooner because people are going to be more centralized in wanting to do things through digital aspects instead of physical. It's really a forced accelerator, I think, to this idea of technology use in culture today. Coronavirus is. It's a forced accelerator. And the church has the opportunity to either get on board or struggle to find a voice that will, I think, get lost over time.
Jeff, you just reminded me that I know you've been pushing out a lot of, and I think you've done a great job, by the way, because you mentioned at the top of this podcast that you're a one-man team, but that you've recruited extra help, and you've been pushing out articles. I'm not sure how often you're pushing them out or blogs, but you're pushing out a lot of good information at this time, and all of that can be found on thechurch.digital, right?
Correct. Yeah, thechurch.digital. We blog. We're posting 2 blogs a day, 2 podcasts a week. There's a leadership lesson here, and I was actually talking about it on my podcast the other day. I'm a one-man shop. Yeah, I've got contractors who do some stuff for me, but it's been far between. And when coronavirus hit, I realized that somebody needs to speak into this. Somebody needs to be the voice for the church to help them get online. And so at the point at that time, I was doing one blog and one podcast or one or two blogs a week. And I realized I need to create more content. Somebody has to lead in this situation, but I myself have limitations. I already was overworked, and realized I didn't have capacity to write and create all this content. And rather than making myself be the focal point of okay, well, it has to be my voice, I have to be the person to say this, I just kind of stepped back and said, hey, who do I know, who do I trust, who has the same vision as me, who can come in and create some of this content. And so I brought in 4 or 5 people, and then as coronavirus kind of got worse, I brought in another 4 or 5 people, and then coronavirus got worse, and now it's like, longer. And so basically at this point I went from, a couple writers to now I've got probably 14, 15 different people all volunteer writing for me. It's on different topics. It's funny, I had a pastor text me this morning, and he has a breakthrough. He's up in Pennsylvania, he's a church planner, and he's trying to figure out how to get into community, and he figured out, wow, I can organizations like Alcoholics Anonymous, figure out how to digital tools to, in this coronavirus season, to engage with people who can't gather together for AA meetings. And he's like, this is an awesome ministry opportunity to even think of. And I'm reading this text from this guy, and I'm like, I didn't think of it either. I've never heard of that. Why don't you write a blog post about that? Another guy, a pastor of a church here locally, a member of his close died. And when I hear that, I'm just like last week in the midst of all this coronavirus stuff. And in my heart, I'm like, how do you grieve in the midst of this season? How do you gather family together to be as a family when you can't hug and touch each other because you're worried about coronavirus? How do you do a funeral when you can't, like, what is this even like in a coronavirus season? These are questions I don't know the answer to. And instead of me trying to figure out that answer is, would you I know you're grieving, I know you're in the middle of this, but you are going through something right now, sir, pastor. Very few people in America are dealing now, but I guarantee over the next 2 months, 3 months, if this thing extends on, more will. So I need you to help us process so that we can know as a church how to lead in those situations and how to help people like you doing this. And so oftentimes it's been in the midst of this pain, hey, somebody write your experience down so others can learn from it.
Mhm.
But instead of being the lid, and this is the thing for me, and I've made this is my fourth business, the Church Digital. I've been the lid of it organizationally for the other three. Like, I've been the brains, I've been the smart one. Everything has to go through me. And as a result of that, like, the business tapped off at the ability that I to lead it. And Intentional Church Digital, especially in this coronavirus season, I just came to this realization. Coronavirus is bigger than Jeff Reed. What the church needs is bigger than Jeff Reed. And so let me bring in, people like us, people that are on the same wavelength, people that can help the church gather together, work through this season of coronavirus, setting it up for hopefully what's to come.
You mentioned how pastors and leaders, like this funeral that you mentioned, the situation that you mentioned. I mean, I hadn't even thought about something like that. So our pastors and our leaders, it's just one example, Jeff. It's a good example of the unprecedented, uncharted situations that pastors and church leaders are facing. And we perhaps as a body, perhaps as a congregation, we have a way of looking to our pastors and our leaders to perhaps have the answers to all of these problems. But again, these are unprecedented challenges. It's hard enough. I mean, Jeff, I think you'd agree with me on this, but it's hard enough to do church or to lead a congregation on a regular Sunday when all things fall into place and all conditions are favorable. It's hard enough to do church when everything falls your way. It's hard enough to do church on any given Sunday, but doing church through a pandemic with social distancing recommendations, with limitations on gatherings, is something that nobody expected. It's something that nobody even imagined. I say that to say that, we've got to have patience with our churches, with our leaders, with our pastors. We have to ask ourselves and challenge ourselves, each one of us, asking ourselves, how can I help? How can I play a role in this? There's one thing that we can all do, of course, and that's pray. No matter who you are, where you are, or how limited we are, we can all pray for our leaders, for our government, for our church leaders and pastors. And there's something that we can all do in one way or another. Jeff, you also mentioned vision a moment ago. Uh, Tell me a little bit about what your vision was, because I know that I believe that God gave you this vision of doing church online, and that you've been able to see it early on when perhaps others haven't been able to see it. What is your vision? What was your vision pre coronavirus, post coronavirus? Where do you see the future of the church within the context of what we've discussed today? Going digital, doing church online, technological advances. Where is it that you've seen the church or hope to see the church 10, 20, 30 years from now?
Yeah, great question. Um, so I can remember looking at a Apple Plus magazine, 1994, which was like Apple's magazine way back then. This is back the Macs were around, but were just kind of rolling out way before iPhone. And I remember seeing the word multimedia for the first time. Multimedia is a mixing, and this is like before the internet. This is before AOL. It's not before the internet. Before the internet went commercial, residential. And I remember seeing this word, and I just vision media mixing of text, of photos, of video, and I had this vision of I was a high school kid. What would it look like for the church to utilize multimedia well? And then quickly 95, 96, I discovered the internet. I was a college freshman at Texas Christian University, and just fell more in love with this idea of creating and engaging a community. In 2000, I was doing online Bible studies with people all over the country through a company I called eBeliever.com. And we had literally, I had people from United Arab Emirates that would join together. This is before Facebook or social media. We would do like text. It was like a bulletin board system, like a Facebook wall now, but once again, this is before Facebook was a thing in 2000. Facebook may have been a thing, but it was only for college kids at the time, probably somewhere around there. But we were going through the book of James, literally 75, 100 different people, different books, gathering together online, having conversations about God. This dream. Now, churches have been doing church online for a long time. Life Church started there. Life.church started their church online 10 years ago. And so, like, I don't want to position myself as the guy who came up with the idea of church online. That's probably Bobby Grunwald. And Bobby, if you're listening, much respect, because he's the guy who was actually able to put that idea into action, probably the first. And he'd tell you the story about how he was really tired of doing setup and teardown at a physical, like a school, to do church. He was like having to set up the stage and the speakers and stuff. And he's a techie guy, and he's like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And that's when he executed his vision of church online. Here's the thing: is that 10 years ago, I believe it was a cutting edge concept. 10 years ago, not a lot of churches were doing it. It's even my own life. 10 years ago, I was hired to be an online pastor, and then in the process of working with that church, they realized they were theologically against church online, and didn't. They ended up shifting me into a different role because it was such a cutting edge concept. It was controversial, and people would either do it or not do it. 10 years later, it's the cool concept. Churches pre-coronavirus, I think, were we're wanting to go to it. We're toying with the next thing, but it was really this cool idea of maybe this is worthwhile. We're just going to experiment with it, but it gives us a lot of street cred to say that we do this online. We're like the cool church now. Through coronavirus, normally when I do this talk pre-coronavirus, I would have said 10 years from now, 2029, you're
Right.
going to see it be commonplace. That was my speech. I've done this speech before. 2029, church online is going to be commonplace. That's where it's going to be widely accepted. The technological swerve that's going to take to adopt this across church, it's going to take 20 years. And between 2009 to 2029, that's the rate that I would see that happen. Coronavirus changed everything because now we are forcing churches, literally, excuse me, we are forcing churches literally to break their wrongly guided theological opinions, which really are more opinions than theological. We're forcing them to do this to embrace an idea of church online. So what's going to happen out of this is an accelerator. We're pouring gasoline on a flame that's going to explode. Coming out of this season, you're going to see a much larger adoption rate of church onlines. You're going to see churches start to plant online because they can't plant anywhere else. I mean, even if it's not a technological thing, here's the reality. On the West Coast right now, somebody told me this stat: 1 out of 5 people are currently unemployed or reduced rate. What is this going to do to the economy if we have to go 2, 3, 4 months into this thing? What is this? How are donations going to look at churches? The reason churches have to close their doors isn't because they're not adopting the technology. It's because there's not the money to sustain the ministry at the level that they're doing it right now. Online is the great equalizer. Some of these guys, Jade Earhart, this guy that I told you about earlier, that's doing an online ministry through video games. He's been doing it for 18 months, almost 2 years at this point. I asked him the other day how much he spent on his church. He told me $5. The man has spent $5 to buy a custom font for a website. Now he gets his salary somewhere else. He's kind of like a co-vocational guy where he's a minister, but he works 9 to 5 somewhere else. But honestly, I don't know that that's a bad model in a bad economy world like I think we're going to be in coming out of this. Once again, don't mean to be alarmist, but the reality is that, and this is where church is going to struggle. Church needs to change. Church needs to evolve.
Mm,
We need to look at the physical church as a model, not the destination, the model.
mm,
The biblical ecclesiology, the biblical functions, what Acts 2 and other verses call us the church to be. What you see at a physical church right now is an example of it. It's a good example. I don't think it's the best example,
mm.
but there's all sorts of examples all over the world. Right now we're seeing pre-coronavirus, I'm not sure what's going on right now, but pre-coronavirus, Giga Church is blowing up in Korea. Some of the largest churches on the planet are in Korea. Some of the smallest churches are coming out of India, which is also blowing up right now in India, where they're seeing almost revival happening from churches that are literally meeting under trees. And so, like, it's the 10 people meeting under a tree, 4 or 5 people huddled in a house. So to say that the giga church model is bad, to say that the small church, the house church, the micro church model is bad, these are all just models. And where the church needs to understand is coming out of coronavirus, the physical church, USA church model needs to be reevaluated. There's some things in there that are going to work. There are some things in there that don't work anymore. And if pastors, if we as church leaders aren't recognizing that we need to let go of the established norm of what was and evolve to what will be, what is effective for today, I'll be honest. I'm more interested in being as effective as possible. Now, I do believe online is the most effective way, or is a effective way, I'll say it that way, to handle the situation we're in today. Listen, if we're all about drive up church, and that's the most effective model to reach people, create a disciple and have them on mission long term, let's launch a bunch of drive up churches, man. We will launch that and do that because that's the right thing. Because in the end, it's not about a model. The model is means to the end, which is discipleship, which is changing and impacting people's lives for God and helping them understand their personal mission. That's the goal. That's the journey's the reward. We need to be focused on the reward, not the journey.
in the time that you've been doing, helping churches to go online, tell us if you're met with hesitation, if you're met with objection, if you're met with protest, tell us a little bit about what those, and you've hinted to this in this
Yeah.
discussion, about theological arguments or perhaps more opinion than theologically based. What, in a nutshell, what are the counter arguments to doing church online? And then I'd like to hear from you as to uh, what your supporting arguments for doing church online are. So, what are the pros and the cons that you've either been met with, that you've received? You know, the pastor that's hesitant, that says, "I don't believe in this. This is
Yeah.
not church. This is not how church was meant to function." What is the basis for that, and what would you say to counter those arguments?
Yeah, I it was funny. I did a podcast with Ed Stetzer just recently. Ed Stetzer's a well-known national pastor, missiologist, good friend. I've known him over the years through a common relationship over at Christ Fellowship Miami, and so I don't drop his name to be like I know Ed Stetzer, but it just was this. He's a mentor of my life, and I really respect him. He is not a church online supporter in general. Now he's evolving in the season of coronavirus because I think a lot of us have to evolve in the season of coronavirus. But traditionally, when it comes to technology, he's been the get off my lawn kind of guy when it comes to technology. By the way, that's his words. If you listen to the podcast, he actually compares himself to like the old guys up in the Muppets overlooking the balcony stage, the cranky old guys Muppets. Yeah. So anyway, it's a thing. Some millennials out there is like, "What's a Muppet?" But that's another
Yeah,
thing.
you just dated yourself.
So yeah, totally, completely. But here's the thing. And so he in this interview, he's like, Jeff, don't talk to me about digital church and church online. You're not gonna. And I'm like, really? I was like, Ed, that's what I do. And he's like, no, you don't ask me those questions. You're not gonna like my answers. And so anyway, I went in and asked the question. What it comes to at some point is, and it's this baking in of Hebrews 10:25 that says, do not abandon gathering together.
Mm.
And actually, I'll actually read it here on air. Um, uh, Not giving up meeting together as some is in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. So yeah, so the church in general would take Hebrews 25 and would say theologically that gathering together is defined by the physical space, the literally breathing of the same air molecules, and cannot be defined virtually. So you and I right now are in a Zoom room. The church would not define this as gathering together, but that we would be neglecting gathering together in this space because we are meeting virtually instead of physically. That was pre-coronavirus. I think that we are seeing in real life massive examples of where gathering together is happening, and that it is the stories out of this will reshape the church culture. Because, I mean, I heard stories last night. I was doing an interview with a girl who's in a seminary class, and so somehow she like got to me and she's like, "Hey, will you do an interview? Can I interview for my class?" And I'm like, "That's great, no problem." And she's telling me a story about how she brought three people to Christ through her online college platform, and they got connected into her Bible study that she's leading online through Zoom. And oh, by the way, they're in like three different states, two time zones. This woman's utilizing her college platform for self learning to witness and evangelize to people, and it worked. Like, how do we balance like stories like that? Stories like a project manager who works with Stadia, who says, Jeff, I connected with one of my high school buddies a couple years ago. If I hadn't heard from him from 20 years, he was going through a divorce. Now I have regular conversations with him through Zoom. We're going through a book of the Bible together. I'm discipling him. Oh, by the way, he lives in Japan. What do you mean gathering together is we're abandoning it by doing it online? So we're seeing examples of this. Here's the problem: the way that church does church online, it really grounds. Typically, if all we do is that 1 hour on Sunday, we're creating consumers. So there's this theory in church. It's called online to offline. The gospel that we learn in the online world has to affect our offline relationships. Said another way, the gospel that we learn listening to services online, listening to podcasts, listening to all the stuff that we're doing here has to not only impact our online persona, our online relationships, our friends online, but it has to show up in our offline world. It has to show up in the physical world. If not, we're a consumer. We're consuming content, but we're not exuding it. We're not showing it. If the only Christ that we're showing is on social media, or if the only Christ that we're showing is listening to a podcast or a sermon or on YouTube, but we're not showing that to the coworkers and the friends around us, yeah, then we're consuming a product that's not affecting our real world. And so the church in itself started this method of, if I'm not discipling people, I think that has to be done physically. I just want to do evangelism. But the extension of that is by not doing the evangelism, by not doing the discipleship, you're not having people on mission so that they can become the Christian that God called them to be, so that they can understand the personal mission that God has for them. And as a result of it, the church actually shot itself in the foot by making more consumers instead of actually making the disciples, making more people on mission, people who are capable of being disciple makers, who can not only feed themselves spiritually, but then go and feed someone else. What do you think of that?
I see the argument that that maybe some pastors have made with regard to the gatherings and referring to the scripture in Hebrews. But I also would say that these times are, again, are unprecedented. And I think that where does that fall into place when you're left with little option to gather? And I think that that's what you've seen, right? So that's where the pastors are forced to make different decisions and perhaps to even act against the basis or the position that they once extended to you. You know, you've seen that yourself. You said it at the top of the podcast, where a pastor some time ago, pre-coronavirus, tells you, I don't believe in that. And then literally that same pastor, on the heels of the outbreak of the coronavirus, is reaching out to you saying, I need to do this essentially, or my church closes its doors. So it's forcing us, as you said, and we've said throughout this podcast, coronavirus seemingly is changing. I mean, one could argue it's changing everything. One could also say that it's going to cause a lot of shift and a lot of cultural change, deeply rooted change in how church looks in the near future. I think you made an absolutely great point in the fact that church technology and advancements are now, it's like we're revving all engines and we're going to see advancements that perhaps we wouldn't have seen so quickly. And maybe some of that will be trial and error. Maybe we're going to see some premature advancements because we're kind of forced to get them out there sooner rather than later. But all in all, we're going to see that churches, maybe pre-coronavirus, Jeff, maybe they were considering the option of going online, whereas now post-coronavirus outbreak, it's no longer an option. I think it's fair to say that churches are forced to seriously consider the online digital platform you've been talking about for so long if they want to stay alive and relevant. And another point that you made a few minutes ago was that you said, and I want to be clear about this because you said that, you know, churches have been doing online for years. And you mentioned an example of Lifeway, who was doing this 10 years ago. But to be clear, that was the exception rather than the norm, right? Yes. So if 10 years ago it was cutting edge technology and only those who were tech savvy and inclined were getting onto this new frontier, you know, now sure it's commonplace to hear about church online, but wouldn't you say that even though it's more commonplace to hear about church online, let me ask you, through your experiences, what percentage of churches are you seeing have lent themselves or gone into this church online? Give me an idea, give our viewers an idea as to how many churches have made the jump onto the online platform, maybe a rough percentage.
Yeah, so there's probably 350,000 evangelical churches in America on average. Um, Pre-coronavirus, I would probably say it was less than 10% that were doing something when it came to broadcasting services online. So call it 20,000, 25,000. And that looks like broadcasting to websites. That looks like broadcasting to social media. When it came to, and this, I'm pretty solid on these numbers, 2019, December, when it came to like small groups, discipleship, it was probably closer to 2 to 300. It was much a smaller number. January 2020 actually saw, I think, a significant shift towards more groups happening online. Maybe it's closer now to a pre-coronavirus, closer to 1,000 or so. But the majority are still just broadcasting services, but not providing some sort of a discipleship opportunity that's happening. With coronavirus happening, obviously it's like I said, it's a force magnifier, multiplier, force accelerator, and so we are seeing that happen at a much larger front. Numerous churches that I work with that were doing nothing are now doing small groups as well as streaming services. So a lot more are onboarding quickly, and there's been a plethora of tools available. And it's not even the church. We're as a community, we're trying to figure out how to do virtual workplace. What does it mean to like work online? What does it mean to be a teacher? What does it mean for this kids to go online? Uh, my wife is creating teaching lessons. My kids are going to school. My son's in a taekwondo class. All of these things are now taught 100% virtually, utilizing the technology, which is just another reason that the church, I don't think, is the driver for the technology. I think coronavirus is the driver of it. And the end result of it is going to be, I think, far more engagement in some of these two-way communication tools like Zoom, like Talkie, like Google Meet, and a much larger adoption rate moving forward.
I think that we need to remain patient, informed, open minded. We need to remain flexible. We're living in a time right now where, as it pertains to the church and pastors and church leaders, our churches are forced to make very, very difficult decisions. A lot of these decisions don't have any precedence. They don't have, a lot of our church leaders don't have experience in how to manage these. And the reality is that if a pastor or a church decides to stay open in this time, they'll be criticized for it. Well, some will criticize them for it. Others will say that they're of great faith. If a church or a pastor decides to close down the church, they will be, some will criticize them for having little faith, and others will applaud them for taking precautions. So it's a time where we are called to make some very difficult decisions. We're not going to get everything right at this time. And by we, I mean the church and pastors and church leaders. So it's important for us to continue to challenge ourselves as to how we can be a contribution to the mission. I think, Jeff, you put it well throughout this podcast, where maybe we should think about the focus being how do we keep our church on mission. And I think that we all have a bit of responsibility when it comes to staying on mission. And of course, we can pray for our churches, for our leaders, for our government, for our pastors. We can also get informed. Jeff, you've given us a lot of good information today. I'm going to do my best to put those resources at the bottom of this YouTube, because again, that's what the point of this podcast was. So what would your maybe your brief, simple message, if you had a word to the church right now, if you thought I can give the church something that might be helpful, or I know what churches are asking, I know what churches need in this time, what would that be?
Yeah, the so much. It's been a great interview, man. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
the time and going through this. And I've thrown a lot of bullets. Probably the last one that I would just kind of hit on is church when you're working with online. Realize a couple things. People are going to connect to community online before they connect to Christ. And that's different than in the physical space. Oftentimes, in the physical space, you see people accept Christ in a service, and then they dive into community. They join a small group. They figure out how to serve. In virtual spaces, people are looking for that community hook first, and oftentimes, they really are looking for engagement. In online circles, to do ministry effectively, you don't want to make statements. You want to ask questions, because making statements doesn't give the online person, the person you're talking to, an opportunity to engage. Throwing out something about a sermon series, or and especially even in this coronavirus season, that's not going to be effective in helping you engage into a communication and inviting somebody who doesn't know Christ into community. If you want to be effective in engaging people, you ask questions. Because let's be honest, in the middle of this coronavirus season, we have no idea what's going on with people. And rather than telling them what we think they need to know and what we think they should do, what if we just ask questions? How are you? What's going on in your world? Learn more about them. And then through that engagement process of us asking these questions, then invite them into a community, invite them into a group, invite them to whatever it is that you're doing. Because people are going to connect to community before they connect to Christ. And if you flip that switch in your head in the online realm, I think you'll find that your ministry is going to be far more effective and influential in reaching people here in today's mid coronavirus season.
Well said. That does it for this episode. Jeff Reed, ladies and gentlemen, from the church dot digital. Stay safe, stay informed. God bless you. And Jeff, one last thing. I can't let you go before saying this. I noticed that box of Yahtzee behind you, and I just want to let you know that you get extra cool points for that right there. Love Yahtzee, and I love your taste. I love your style, my friend.
Awesome. Yeah, but that's one of our family games. I actually hate it because my wife and kids are so much better. I lose every time. My wife will roll multiple Yahtzees. It's crazy the power that she has over rolling dice. It's awesome. But hey, thanks for that notice. I totally appreciate that.
Yeah, I grew up on Yahtzee, so you still get some cool points. Love it.
Awesome.
Thanks, Jeff.
Hey, thanks, Anthony.